Yo, kill him. Sit. Too low, right here, out front.
What is the single decoy configuration that makes a mallard flock lock wings and commit without circling? And why do most solo hunters never figure it out because they keep copying what they see guide services use with full crews? Carl Brewster, 58 years old, had been hunting mallards alone on public ground along the upper Mississippi River corridor in Crawford County, Wisconsin, since his late 20s, which gave him roughly 30 seasons of figuring out what works when there is nobody to help you carry decoys, nobody to flag, and nobody to blame when a flock circles and leaves without finishing. Last November, he called me after a morning hunt and described what he had put together. 6 mallards down from one flock before 8 in the morning. Solo. 17 decoys. One specific configuration he had been refining for 2 seasons that he called the social stack. I drove up to Wisconsin the following week, and he walked me through it field-side. What I watched him demonstrate changed how I think about why ducks commit and why they circle. The social stack is counterintuitive in a specific way that takes some explaining, and I want to give you the full reasoning before I give you the setup, because the reasoning is what makes it stick. I have covered the C-spread landing hole geometry and the 424 calling protocol in previous videos, and if you understand those concepts, the social stack slots right into that framework. If you are coming to this cold, the principle still stands on its own. Stay through to the end. Carl has a modification he makes specifically when hunting fields with standing water rather than open water, and it flips the standard spread orientation in a way I had never considered. It is the last thing he explained, and in my experience since watching it, it is what separates the 3-bird mornings from the 6-bird mornings on the kind of public ground most solo hunters are actually hunting. Before anything else, check your regulations. Mallard hunting falls under federal migratory waterfowl regulation. You need a federal duck stamp, your state's waterfowl license, and HIP registration in most states. Steel shot is mandatory everywhere for waterfowl. Wisconsin runs a split season with specific dates and species-based limits that change annually. Your state's current season dates and limits are at your state wildlife agency website. 2 minutes now beats a conservation violation later. The conventional wisdom on decoy spreads says, more decoys create a stronger visual signal, and the landing hole should be empty to give birds a place to land. Both of those things are mostly true. The part that is left out is what the visual signal is actually communicating to an incoming bird, and why the empty landing hole, in some specific conditions, is actually suppressing commitment rather than enabling it. A mallard approaching a standard spread from altitude is running a rapid visual threat assessment. The questions it is answering are not exactly conscious, but they are behavioral. Are those birds relaxed? Are they feeding? Is there a reason to land there? And is there space for me to land safely? The standard spread with an open landing hole answers the third question with a visual picture of birds distributed across a water or field surface in no particular concentration, which reads as birds that are present but not particularly excited about anything. No concentrated food source, no feeding competition, just birds sitting. The social stack addresses what Carl calls the feeding signal problem. When wild mallards find a concentrated food source, whether it is waste grain in a field corner or an aquatic food concentration on a shallow flat, they do not distribute evenly across the available water surface. They stack up. They crowd into the area where the food is. You get 10 birds in an 8-foot circle, roughly the diameter of a standard kitchen table, all actively feeding, all creating water disturbance, all in competition for the same concentrated resource. That visual picture communicates something different than a standard spread. This specific spot has food, and it is worth competing for. The social stack replicates that visual signal by concentrating 8 to 10 decoys into a tight cluster positioned at the near edge of what would otherwise be the landing hole. The cluster is roughly 6 to 8 feet in diameter, about the size of a large area rug, with the decoys close enough that they make contact with each other and create consistent motion from the wave action of any movement. The jerk cord or motion device runs through the center of the cluster rather than through the spread at large. The tight concentration and the motion together produce a visual signal that reads as active feeding competition, concentrated food source, right here. Incoming birds do not land on the cluster. They land next to it, on the open water or open ground between the cluster and your position. That open area is still the landing zone, but now it has a purpose. It is the only available space adjacent to where the food obviously is. Birds are not landing in a generic open area. They are landing as close as possible to the feeding activity, which is the natural behavior of a bird joining an established feeding group. The approach and the commitment both happen faster and with less circling because the birds have identified a specific reason to land at a specific location rather than a general reason to land somewhere in the spread. Carl described the first morning he used the tight cluster configuration on his Crawford County ground. He had been watching a piece of shallow flooded field margin where mallards fed in the evenings for 3 consecutive days, and every evening he watched 30 to 40 birds drop in from altitude without circling, without working the area, without the typical cautious multiple pass behavior he had seen those same birds use in other locations. He realized the birds were landing directly into a feeding group rather than into an empty area. The next morning he set 17 decoys in the social stack configuration, and the first flock of 12 birds made one pass at about 200 yards, roughly 2 football fields, turned back, and finished without a second circle. He killed 3. The flock scattered. Birds returned in singles and pairs over the next 40 minutes, and he had his limit of 6 mallards before 8 o'clock. That is one morning on one piece of ground. His results since have been consistent enough that he has not gone back to a standard spread for field or flooded flat hunting. The number of decoys in the cluster matters less than the concentration. Carl runs 8 to 10 in the cluster, depending on what he is carrying that morning. He has run 6 in tight conditions with smaller flocks, and the configuration still worked. The cluster functions at smaller decoy counts than a standard spread because the visual signal is about density, not about total number. 8 decoys in a 6-foot cluster, about the diameter from the pitcher's rubber to just past the front edge of the pitching mound, creates a denser visual than 40 decoys spread across a standard 40-yard spread. The remaining 7 or 8 decoys from his standard 17 go into a loose arc behind and to the sides of the cluster, positioned as if they are individual birds that have fed their fill and are now loafing or drifting away from the main feeding activity. These birds complete the social picture. The cluster says, active feeding, concentrated food, competition happening. The loose birds around it say, enough food that birds have finished and are still present. Area is safe, established enough that birds are relaxed. Together, they create a spread that reads as a successful feeding situation rather than a group of birds waiting around. The setup relative to wind is the same as a standard spread. Cluster is positioned so the landing zone between the cluster and your position is aligned with the approach corridor from the downwind side. Birds land into the wind, approach from downwind, and the cluster is positioned so the open landing zone is between the approach direction and the cluster. You are always between the cluster and the downwind approach direction. The cluster is always on the far side of the landing zone from where birds will come in. They drop through the open zone and land adjacent to the feeding activity. For solo hunting specifically, the social stack has an operational advantage that a group spread does not. Setting up a social stack with 17 decoys takes Carl less than 20 minutes from truck to ready. He does not need a partner to cover ground while he sets decoys. He is not leaving one end of a spread unattended while he strings anchors on the other end. The cluster goes in first, 8 to 10 decoys in a roughly 6-foot circle with anchor lines kept short, about 12 inches per decoy, roughly the length from your elbow to your fingertips, so the cluster stays dense in any wind condition. Then the loose arc birds go in, working outward from the cluster in about 5 minutes. The whole setup is compact enough to carry in 2 bags and set without repositioning the truck. I want to address a skepticism point directly, because if you have been hunting ducks for any length of time, you have probably been told specifically that you need an open landing hole, and that crowding decoys together prevents birds from landing. That advice is not wrong for a standard spread. It is describing what happens when you crowd decoys randomly without creating the concentrated feeding signal. The difference is intentionality. Random crowding produces decoys that look like birds that cannot find space, which reads as unnatural crowding rather than feeding competition. The social stack is a deliberately tight cluster positioned at a specific location for a specific behavioral reason. The birds that see it are not reading crowded birds. They are reading a feeding competition that is worth joining. There are conditions where the social stack does not produce the results it does on calm water or flooded fields, and I want to cover them specifically because they are real failure modes rather than edge cases. Fast-moving river current is the first problem. The tight anchor lines that keep the cluster dense in still water or light wind will not hold decoys in a tight configuration in current stronger than about walking pace, roughly the speed where you feel mild resistance moving through water. Current moves decoys downstream to the limit of their anchor lines and turns the cluster into a scattered line rather than a tight group. On moving water, the social stack is better approximated by running a shorter jerk cord through the center of a looser cluster with longer anchor lines, and accepting that current will create natural motion rather than trying to maintain the tight configuration against the water. High wind above 20 miles per hour, roughly the sustained speed where you feel steady resistance extending your arm, disrupts the cluster by creating wave action that pushes decoys out of position even with short anchor lines. In these conditions, Carl adds a secondary anchor on each cluster decoy using a simple split ring and a spare cord, so each bird is anchored from 2 points and cannot drift more than a foot from its original position. This takes an extra 15 minutes to set up, and he does not do it unless the forecast is consistently above 20. Below 20, the short single anchors hold well enough. Heavily vegetated water, cattail margins, and flooded timber where birds are approaching through trees rather than open sky often produce commitment patterns that the social stack cannot address because the birds are not making a visual approach from altitude. They are threading in low through cover and making their landing decision at close range based on sound and immediate visual confirmation rather than the wide-angle visual assessment the social stack is designed to trigger. In these conditions, motion and calling discipline matter more than cluster configuration. Carl keeps a simple 3-bird floating cluster near his position in timber hunts, but does not run the full social stack because the visual signal never has the range to work the way it does in open water or fields. The gear that supports the social stack approach for a solo hunter is worth covering because it differs from what a 4-man layout blind crew needs. Carl runs Avian X full-body mallard decoys for the cluster birds because they have realistic body posture, and the head and tail motion in light wind adds to the feeding activity signal. He runs hardcore floaters in the arc birds because they are lighter to carry, and he does not need the same motion quality in the looser positioned birds. The difference in weight matters when one person is carrying everything from the truck. He carries 2 6 decoy bags and 1 4 decoy bag, which gets him to 17 decoys in 3 trips. The cluster birds go in the heaviest bag because they need the ballast of the full-body decoys, and he carries that bag last so he is not fatigued when he is making the critical cluster position decisions. His gun for solo field hunting is a Benelli M2 in 12 gauge with a modified choke running heavy shot in 3-inch loads. The M2 cycles reliably in cold, wet conditions without the manual action cycling that pump guns require, and that tends to break the 4-second window if you need a follow-up shot. On a 6-bird morning in a tight flock scenario, follow-up shots on the same pass matter because the flock has not yet scattered when the first shot breaks. The modified choke at 15 to 20 yards, roughly from a foul line to the first row of seats in a small theater, gives enough pattern spread for the close shots the social stack produces without the pattern gaps that sometimes open at close range with tight chokes. The piece I want to cover at the end is the field modification Carl mentioned, and it is specifically for situations where birds are working flooded crop fields with shallow standing water rather than open water. In open water, the social stack cluster is on the far side of the landing zone from the blind, with the landing zone between the blind and the cluster. Birds approach from downwind, land in the zone, and the cluster is beyond the landing zone at roughly 20 to 25 yards from the blind, roughly the distance from the free throw line to the basket, and a few feet beyond. In shallow flooded fields, Carl flips this. The cluster goes between the blind and where birds would naturally land. He positions the cluster at about 12 to 15 yards from the blind, roughly the distance of a short parking space, and the landing zone is beyond the cluster at 20 to 30 yards. The birds approach from downwind, see the cluster at close range as they are completing their approach, and make their final landing decision to put down just past the cluster, rather than in it. They come over the cluster at about 6 to 8 feet, roughly the height of a standard basketball backboard, and land beyond it at a distance that is still well within range. The reason he does this in fields rather than open water is about how mallards read the visual from low altitude during a field approach. In open water, birds make a wide visual assessment from high altitude before committing. In a field approach, birds often fly lower from the start and make their commitment decision closer to the deck because the terrain provides reference, and they are reading the field surface at a lower angle. At low approach altitude, a tight cluster close to the blind creates a stronger visual pull than a cluster positioned farther out, because the bird's approach trajectory crosses over or near the cluster before they land. They want to land where the feeding activity is. They see it at 12 yards as they come over it low and slow, and they put down right past it within shot range. Carl has run this field version on 3 properties in Crawford County over 2 seasons. His description of how the birds come in on the close cluster field version is that they look like they are parking rather than landing, which is his way of saying they come in flat, slow, and fully committed rather than with the cautious, high-entry approach that pressured birds show when they are still evaluating. They have already decided before they cross the blind position. 17 decoys, 1 tight cluster, 1 morning in November, 6 mallards from 1 flock. The social stack is not a secret because the information is obscure. It is underused because the standard spread advice does not explain why concentrated feeding signal works differently than distributed presence. Now you know the why. The rest is execution.